It started like any ordinary day on the streets of a quiet city, but what unfolded next would leave everyone stunned. A racist cop, fueled by his own prejudices, confronted a young black man on the sidewalk. Tensions ran high as the officer's hostility quickly escalated. What seemed like just another routine interaction took a dangerous turn when the cop, without warning, lashed out and punched the man square in the face. But what happened next was something no one expected. The man, who had been provoked and pushed to his limits, fought back. In a flash, the roles reversed. The officer, who had been confident in his authority, was caught off guard by the sudden resistance. His shock was evident as he tried to regain control of the situation, but the young man wasn't backing down. As the struggle continued, onlookers watched in disbelief, unsure of what would happen next. Would the officer regain his power, or had he underestimated the man's resolve? Stay tuned to find out what happens when the tables are turned, and justice begins to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The officer, Officer Reynolds, had a reputation. Known for his aggressive tactics and quick temper, he wasn't one to let anyone challenge his authority. For years, he'd been able to get away with intimidation, using his badge as a shield against scrutiny. But this wasn't just any routine stop. The young man, Marcus, wasn't going to just stand by and let it happen. Marcus had seen enough. Growing up in a world where he'd been taught to always comply, he had learned to be cautious around authority figures. But there was something different about that day. Something snapped inside him as the officer's words grew sharper, his actions more forceful. The insult that had triggered Marcus wasn't just the punch. It was the years of built-up injustice, the way people like him were constantly pushed aside and treated unfairly. As the altercation unfolded, a small crowd began to gather. Some were unsure of what they were witnessing, while others knew all too well what it meant. For them, it was another example of the constant struggle many faced when confronted by those who held power. And yet, despite the fear that lingered in the air, there was something else too, something powerful. Marcus wasn't just fighting back for himself, he was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced. But even as the tension mounted, no one could predict how this would end. Would this moment spark something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored? Or was this just another incident that would fade away, lost to time? As the scuffle between Marcus and Officer Reynolds continued, the crowd around them grew. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone instinctively knew that something bigger was at play. Among the onlookers was Jessica, a local reporter who had arrived just in time to capture the chaotic scene. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she recorded what was unfolding before her eyes. Jessica had covered protests, rallies, and court cases before, but this felt different. It was personal. She'd seen enough injustice to know how easily these situations could be spun, depending on who was telling the story. She feared that if this wasn't documented, it might be swept under the rug, just like so many others before it. Nearby, Marcus's cousin Elijah stood watching, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always looked up to Marcus, admiring his calm demeanor and resilience. But today, something was different. Elijah saw the anger in Marcus's eyes, the frustration of being mistreated for years, the pain of never being heard. Elijah had witnessed Marcus try to de-escalate situations, always doing the right thing. But now, seeing his cousin stand his ground against the officer, Elijah realized just how much this moment meant. It was a turning point, not only for Marcus, but for everyone who had felt powerless for too long. Officer Reynolds, on the other hand, was losing control. His training, meant to diffuse tension, was failing him. He had always relied on his authority to impose fear, but Marcus wasn't backing down. The officer's usual tactics, threatening, shouting, and using intimidation, seemed ineffective now. The punch had only ignited the fire. Reynolds' confidence wavered as Marcus stood tall, defying everything the officer had come to expect from people who looked like him. It was as if the tables had turned, and suddenly, the officer didn't know how to handle it. As the minutes ticked by, it was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy resolution. The crowd had grown larger, with some whispering to each other about what they were seeing. Some supported Marcus, whispering encouragement, while others hesitated, unsure of where their loyalty should lie. Everyone had a different story, a different angle on what was happening, but one thing was certain: this wasn't just a random confrontation. It was the latest chapter in an ongoing struggle, one that no one could ignore any longer. Jessica's fingers hovered over her phone screen, unsure of whether to post the video now or wait. She knew that once it was out there, it couldn't be taken back. The pressure to get the story right, to show both sides, was heavy. But even in that moment, with the world watching, she knew this wasn't just a story. This was a battle for respect, for justice, and for the truth. And in that struggle, everything, every choice, would have consequences. The standoff had reached a boiling point, and the air was thick with anticipation. Marcus and Officer Reynolds stood facing each other, neither one backing down. The crowd had grown silent, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Marcus's fists were clenched, his body tense, but his gaze remained steady. The officer, on the other hand, was visibly rattled, his face flushed with anger and confusion. His training told him to assert his dominance, to regain control, but nothing was working. In the background, Elijah's heart raced as he watched Marcus, praying that this wouldn't end in violence. He had always believed in the power of words and peaceful protest, but today he wasn't sure if words were enough. The injustice had gone too far, and Marcus's defiance felt like the only way to take a stand. Elijah had never seen his cousin like this, so full of fire and determination. He wanted to call out to him, to tell him to be careful, but he knew that there was no going back now. Marcus had made his choice, and it was a choice that could change everything. Jessica, still recording, couldn't look away. She knew she had a story, an explosive one, but her thoughts kept racing. Was she capturing the truth, or was she just documenting another clash between an officer and a civilian? She saw the faces in the crowd, some of them looking hopeful, others full of fear. Some had their phones out, ready to broadcast this moment to the world. Jessica's mind was torn between wanting to stay objective and feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that, for better or worse, this incident could spark something much bigger. But what would that something be? Just then, Officer Reynolds took a step forward, his hand reaching for his radio. The movement felt deliberate, like he was about to escalate the situation further, to call for backup, to bring in more officers, more force. His eyes darted to the crowd, assessing the situation. It was clear he was trying to regain control, but his confidence was cracking. The power he once held over situations like this seemed to be slipping away, and the more he tried to assert himself, the more his frustration grew. Marcus saw the officer's hand move, his instincts kicking in. Was this the moment things would spiral out of control? He had been pushed past his limit, but was he willing to take this fight further? Every muscle in his body screamed for him to act. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. He knew he couldn't afford to let fear dictate his next move. If he did, it would be the same old story, one where he was silenced, pushed aside, and made to feel powerless. But if he stood his ground, if he made the officer see him, maybe, just maybe, it would be different this time. The crowd held its breath as the moment hung in the air, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. What would happen next? Would the situation spiral into chaos? Or would something shift, something none of them could predict? Every eye was on them, and the world seemed to stand still, waiting for the final spark. Just as Marcus braced himself for whatever move Officer Reynolds might make, a sudden, unexpected noise cut through the tension. A siren, but not from a squad car. It was the unmistakable sound of an approaching ambulance, its lights flashing as it weaved through the growing crowd. For a brief moment, everyone froze. The siren's wail echoed in the streets, filling the air with an eerie sense of urgency, but it wasn't just the arrival of emergency services that threw the situation into chaos. The ambulance screeched to a halt just feet away, and as the doors swung open, another officer stepped out. This wasn't just any officer. It was Sergeant Harris, Reynolds' longtime partner, known for his no-nonsense attitude and strict enforcement of the law. But there was something different about Harris' appearance today. His expression was one of concern, not control. He scanned the scene quickly, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Reynolds, who looked increasingly out of sorts. Jessica caught the shift in the air immediately. Her camera, still recording, zoomed in on Harris' arrival. Was this backup or something more? The new officer's gaze flicked to the crowd, then to Marcus, before finally settling on Reynolds, who now appeared even more rattled. Harris wasn't moving toward Marcus. Instead, he stepped closer to his partner, speaking in low, tense words that no one could hear. But the body language between them was telling. There was tension in the way Harris stood, like he wasn't entirely sure which side he was on. Marcus noticed a shift. Something was happening, but he wasn't sure what. This wasn't the typical backup situation. There was an underlying shift in the power dynamics that he couldn't quite place. Was this just another layer of the same old game, or was Harris here to change the course of things? With Reynolds visibly shaken, the dynamics had already shifted, but now it seemed like they were about to shift again. Elijah, standing at the edge of the crowd, could feel the change too. His cousin hadn't just stood up to one cop, he had inadvertently triggered a bigger conflict. The situation had gone beyond personal confrontation. Elijah's thoughts raced, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that the stakes had just been raised. If this went public, it could ignite something far bigger than anyone anticipated. The question now wasn't just whether Marcus could stand his ground, it was whether the entire system was about to be exposed for all its flaws. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers running like wildfire. No one knew how to interpret the sudden arrival of Harris, and no one knew what was coming next. All eyes were on the two officers now, waiting for some sign of what this meant. The heat of the moment felt like it could break at any second, and with the cameras rolling, the weight of what might happen next was unbearable. Would Harris' arrival calm the storm, or was it the spark that would set everything off? The air was thick with uncertainty as Harris and Reynolds stood facing each other. The crowd, now restless, sensed the shift. The tension between the two officers was palpable, something deeper than just a disagreement. It was like the unspoken truth was finally bubbling to the surface. Harris, his eyes locked on Reynolds, took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he did something that caught everyone off guard. He reached out, placing a firm hand on Reynolds' shoulder. For a moment, Reynolds stiffened, as if the touch was a threat. But Harris didn't look threatening. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding control. Instead, there was a quiet, almost reluctant gesture in his stance. The crowd waited in suspense, unsure whether this would de-escalate the conflict or ignite something even more explosive. Reynolds, Harris finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You've crossed a line. This isn't how we do things. Not anymore." The words hit like a bombshell. People began to murmur, some in disbelief, others in quiet shock. Reynolds stood frozen, blinking as though trying to comprehend what was happening. His face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion, but Harris's gaze never wavered. The shift in power was undeniable now. Reynolds wasn't in control anymore. As the reality of the moment sank in, Jessica, still recording, realized she was witnessing something far bigger than she had imagined. This wasn't just a confrontation between a civilian and an officer. It was a breaking point in the system itself. The truth was unfolding in front of her lens. But before she could react, something else happened that no one saw coming. Marcus, standing silently in the midst of it all, took a step back. His fists, still clenched moments before, slowly loosened. He had been ready for more, prepared to stand his ground. But now, seeing the shift between the two officers, a new understanding washed over him. It was no longer just about fighting back. It was about standing firm in a different way. With the crowd still watching, he straightened up, and for the first time, his eyes met Harris. In that brief moment, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected, an ally. not in the traditional sense, but an ally in the fight for change, for accountability. But just as the moment of potential resolution hung in the air, the final twist hit. A second police car pulled up to the scene, this one speeding in with urgency. As the officers inside rushed out, it became clear. These were internal affairs. The presence of IA officers added a whole new layer to the situation. They had been monitoring Reynolds for months, tracking complaints, and now they had arrived. For a moment, everything stopped. The street went eerily quiet, the crowd watching in silence. The IA officers approached, their focus directly on Reynolds and the situation that had just unfolded. The realization was dawning. This was no longer just a simple confrontation. It was the beginning of an investigation that could change everything. Marcus felt the weight of it all in that moment. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was bigger than him, bigger than any one person. And as the internal affairs officers moved in to take control of the situation, the crowd began to disperse, whispers of the encounter spreading like wildfire. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. But there was one final detail that would leave everyone stunned. As the IA officers began to question Reynolds, Harris quietly pulled out his phone, typing something quickly. A single message sent at that exact moment. Asterisk, it's done. The system's broken. Let's fix it. Asterisk, the world, it seemed, was about to hear a very different kind of truth. As the internal affairs officers took charge, the tension in the air began to lift, but the weight of what had just transpired still lingered. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their whispers continuing, but now there was a sense of quiet reflection. Marcus stood there for a moment, his heart still racing, but there was no fight left in him. He had done what he set out to do, stand his ground. But now, it was in the hands of those who held the power to make change. Jessica, still recording, knew she had captured more than just a fight. She had documented a pivotal moment in a much larger story, one that could no longer be ignored. As she reviewed the footage, she realized that what was unfolding was part of a deeper reckoning, one that reached beyond this single encounter. The world was watching, and this moment, this shift in power, would spark a conversation that needed to be had. People were beginning to see the cracks in the system, cracks that had always been there, but were now exposed in full view. Elijah, watching from the sidelines, felt a sense of hope. His cousin had faced the officer, yes, but it was the truth that had come to light that truly mattered. As the IA officers escorted Reynolds away, he couldn't help but wonder, could this be the start of something new? A new chapter where change was possible. The story wasn't over, it was only just beginning.